Everybody, and welcome to Birds of Newfoundland, a deep dive. We're quickly approaching the end of this series. This is our second last talk tonight, and we're happy to have you here with us again. Or if you're new to us tonight, welcome. And I'll just do a quick introduction before we get into the meat and potatoes tonight. My name is Jenna McDermott. I'm the assistant coordinator for the Newfoundland Breeding Bird Atlas in Newfoundland, and Catherine Dale is on the call here as well. She's the coordinator for the Atlas, and we both work for Birds Canada, which is a nationwide charitable organization whose mission is to advance the understanding, appreciation, and conservation of wild birds and their habitats. So this is a nationwide organization, as I said, and we do have over 70,000 volunteers nationwide, which is an incredible number, and they're working all across the country, collecting data for several bird surveys and different programs that we run across the country. So they submit the data to Birds Canada, and using that data, we can assist in bird conservation throughout Canada. So 2 Newfoundland programs that we're running right now. The first is the Newfoundland Breeding Bird Atlas. And this is a 5-year effort to map out the abundance and distribution of all of the bird species that breed in Newfoundland. We have finished year 3 of our data collection period, and we have 2 more years left. So everybody is welcome to join in that effort, no matter what your level of birding skills are. The second program that we run in Newfoundland is the Nocturnal Owl Survey. And this survey takes place between April 1st and May 15th each year. And it involves citizen scientists listening for owls along a set route every spring and reporting back to us what they've heard. So that's going to be coming up sooner than we know. And both programs are always looking for new volunteers. So if you're interested in joining either one of these or both, you can check out our website, which is nf.birdatlas.ca, or you can email us. And Catherine, maybe you can put that information in the chat. And finally, before I hand it over to our speaker, I'd just like to thank all of our partners and funders, because without their support, we wouldn't be able to do workshops like this. And also thank you to all of you who come out to support us every week. And now to the exciting part. We have our speaker here tonight is Kathleen Manson. And Kathleen is originally from BC, but she currently lives in Ontario, which is also where she did her undergraduate degree at the University of Toronto in forest conservation. She then completed her master's at the University of Guelph in environmental sciences and has been working in urban forestry and in the private and public sectors since then. Kathleen and I actually know each other from her first time in Newfoundland when she was a field technician for my own master's work. And I know her to be a fantastic birder, a joyful field companion, and an incredibly intelligent person in general. This past summer, myself and the Atlas field team were very lucky to have Kathleen join us for a couple of weeks of point count surveys. And we're very happy to have her here tonight to talk to us about Rusty Blackbirds. So welcome, Kathleen, and we look forward to your presentation.
Thank you. Thank you very much. All right. Well, yes, Jenna, you are wonderful to work with as well. I will get going. All right. So, whoops. Can everybody see what's going on here?
Yep.
The presentation slides. All right. So, yes, my name is Kathleen Manson. I stumbled sort of into this research because of Jenna, who, as Jenna mentioned, I worked for when she was doing her research on gray-cheeked thrush. So I worked as a field technician for her in 2017. And we worked on this research actually together as well on Rusty Blackbirds. So many thanks throughout the presentation to Jenna for her contributions here and her co-authorship on our paper together. Now, you'll have to forgive me if I'm a bit rusty. because I haven't presented this information in some time. But I am excited to be here to share with you about Rusty Blackbird habitat occupancy on the island of Newfoundland. And just a little bit more about the research, just generally, it was a collaboration between myself and Jenna, of course, and Dr. Ian Warkentin of Memorial University of Newfoundland, and Derek Whitaker of Parks Canada, and Dr. Luke Powell of the Smithsonian Institute and of the University of Glasgow. As Jenna mentioned, I also spent a few weeks this year in Newfoundland helping to collect data for the Newfoundland Breeding Bird Atlas, and I can't stress enough how, how wonderful an experience it was, and also just how important I know the Breeding Bird Atlas is to be in terms of contributing to bird conservation. So, if you're not a volunteer yet, maybe the Rusty Blackbird might be that species that gets you hooked and inspires you to become a volunteer. So Rusty Blackbirds. Rusty Blackbirds have also been known historically as rusty grackles, and they're a songbird in the family Icteridae. And this family also includes several other species, including bobolinks, eastern meadowlarks, and Baltimore orioles, and red-winged blackbirds, and of course common grackles. And the Rusty Blackbird's name is a very helpful hint for their identification, both in their breeding and non-breeding habitat. So firstly, as you can see in the photo on the right, Rusty Blackbirds in their non-breeding plumage have a sort of rusty brown color. So that's maybe one reason they're rusty. And then the other reason that I've heard for their name is that their song sounds a bit like a rusty hinge on a door opening, and that's one tip I really like. So that's helpful here in Newfoundland. For example, if you're conducting breeding bird atlas surveys, then you hear that rusty door hinge. That's a Rusty Blackbird. So like many birds, their plumage varies drastically between breeding and non-breeding seasons, and they're black glossy birds and the pale kind of whitish yellow eye during the breeding season. And the female is a bit more drab. In contrast, in their non-breeding plumage, they have sort of the tips of their feathers are sort of that rusty auburn color, and so they might look quite brown like that, or it might just more look like kind of flecking on their bodies. And so as you'll probably know if you're in Newfoundland, Rusty Blackbirds are the most widespread of blackbirds on Newfoundland, and research and citizen science like the Atlas will help us understand how widespread other blackbirds are on Newfoundland. But luckily, because they're the most common and widespread, it's easy to tell that it's a Rusty Blackbird on Newfoundland. They're distinct from common grackles because grackles are larger and have that wedge-shaped tail, long tail, and large beak. And of course, red-winged blackbirds with their brilliant red and beige patches on their shoulders. Of course, if you hear an individual singing, that's a really good indicator of the species. Brewer's blackbirds are the most closely related to Rusty Blackbird, so they're in the same genus, but they're not known to occur on Newfoundland. So Rusty Blackbirds breed across the boreal forest of North America, and they winter in the southeastern United States. So in this map from All About Birds, the pink color on the top represents the breeding range, and the blue is the wintering range. And the yellow region is where you might find Rusty Blackbirds during migration. And within their breeding range, they eat primarily aquatic invertebrates. So unsurprisingly, they're known to be associated with wet habitat, bogs, lakes, and rivers and streams and other wet habitats like that. And they're also associated with conifer forests. This is because they're known to nest in conifers. So they need that combination of conifer forest and wet habitat. And here's just an example of one site where this past breeding season, while conducting surveys, I spotted a rusty blackbird. And as you can see, it's wet habitat surrounded by conifer forest. Seems like the perfect spot to see a rusty blackbird. So in this example, I first heard the call, that rusty hinge, and then I spotted him foraging across the edge of the lake. A typical encounter with the foraging rusty blackbird. So we can speak a little bit about population trends. Like many migratory songbirds, unfortunately, rusty blackbird populations have been in decline, and there is qualitative evidence of declines over the past century or more, and extreme and quantified declines over the past half century. So, for example, according to the North American Breeding Bird Survey data, rusty blackbird populations have decreased across Canada between 1970 and 2019 by over 80%. Over 80% decrease in population in that time period. So that's quite huge. And as an aside, the Breeding Bird Survey is another example of a really valuable long-term monitoring project that relies on volunteers as well as staff scientists to, provide meaningful insight into bird populations. And so reasons for these declines are not very well known, although there might be a number of potential reasons. So in the United States, in the southern United States, rusty blackbirds winter, and in this region, there is like rice pasture and things like that. So on agricultural land, blackbirds have been considered pests and treated as such. So it's possible that rusty blackbirds, if flocking with blackbirds that do consume agricultural grain crops, if they're flocking with those birds, they might be either killed or disrupted as essentially as bycatch. And that was sort of mentioned by Dr. Russ Greenberg in 2011 sort of overall study on rusty blackbirds, encompassing all of the different reasons for potential declines. And changes to land use might be affecting rusty blackbirds both in the breeding and non-breeding range. So Luke Powell, who again was a co-author on this research that we conducted, he and colleagues in 2010 performed a study that suggested that harvested stands in the forests in their study sites in New England may be acting as ecological traps for rusty blackbirds. So specifically, they found that while rusty blackbirds didn't seem to prefer unaltered habitat over harvested stands, these harvested stands have like dense conifer region, so that's a really nice place for them to nest. So in combination with wet habitat, they might nest there. They didn't prefer one or the other, the unaltered or the harvested stands, but they did have lower survivorship and success in those harvested stands. So this is an example of a potential ecological trap in these harvested forests. And the reason that the harvested stands might have had more lower success rates could have been because of predator, like these sites are more easily accessed by predators because of the disturbance. There's also been research showing that excessive mercury in the diets of rusty blackbirds might be contributing to declines, and climate change as the resulting temperature rises and wetlands drying up might be reducing their aquatic invertebrate prey, which may reduce rusty blackbird populations. And in fact, the research that I'm describing here also showed an inverse correlation between rusty blackbirds and the Pacific decadal oscillations, which is further potential, which furthers the possibility that climate change could have a negative impact on rusty blackbirds as climate warms. So rusty blackbirds on Newfoundland. Under Canada's Species at Risk Act, rusty blackbirds are listed as special concern. And in Newfoundland, they are listed as vulnerable under the Provincial Endangered Species Act in Newfoundland and Labrador. And Newfoundland is a unique place for rusty blackbirds, so it's really important that we understand rusty blackbirds on the island more. Firstly, the number of rusty blackbirds detected in breeding bird survey routes has been consistently higher in the past on Newfoundland than in the rest of the breeding bird survey routes. This was pointed out by Dr. Russ Greenberg and colleagues, who noted that between 1980 and 2005, the mean number of rusty blackbirds per survey route was just over 2 birds per survey route on Newfoundland, whereas the mean number of rusty blackbirds per survey route across all survey routes was only 0.26 birds per survey route between 1966 and 2005. That's a lot, that's wordy, but roughly speaking, that would mean that if you detected 8 rusty blackbirds on a survey route on Newfoundland, you may only detect 1 on a survey route outside of Newfoundland. So this is pretty substantial. If rusty blackbirds are more abundant, if this is a bit of a safe haven for them for some reason, then it's critical that we understand better how rusty blackbirds use habitat, their breeding habitat on Newfoundland, and to protect their habitat. So secondly, it's been proposed that that rusty blackbirds on Newfoundland are a unique subspecies, Euphagus carolinus nigrans, because of their darker plumage. That's been noted by Peter Pyle. And Harold Peters and Thomas Burley published this information in the 1940s based on those plumage differences, suggesting that rusty blackbirds in Atlantic Canada may be a subspecies. And this exciting research that was just published last year by Robert Wilson and his colleagues found rusty blackbirds to be genetically distinct from blackbirds across the breeding range. I am not a geneticist, so I can't admittedly go into too much detail about that research, but it is it is confirming, sort of supporting the suggestion that rusty blackbirds are in fact a subspecies on Newfoundland, and that's further reason to understand rusty blackbirds on Newfoundland better. All right, so I will get into our research here on Newfoundland. The purpose of the study was to assess rusty blackbird habitat occupancy. So in other words, we wanted to see what groupings of landscape features were most likely to host rusty blackbirds. And also, because portions of the study site had been harvested between 1990 and 2004, they had been clear cut. So we secondarily wanted to know, are these clear cuts associated with rusty blackbirds? Don't forget that there had been previous research suggesting that harvested forest stands may be acting as ecological traps for rusty blackbirds. And so we also wanted to see if there was a clear relationship between the presence of introduced squirrels, red squirrels, and rusty blackbirds. So you'll recall from Jenna's presentation a few weeks ago that that red squirrels are known to be opportunistic nest predators, and that species like gray-cheeked thrush are highly sensitive to that and were found to be negatively correlated with red squirrels on the landscape. Also worth noting is that a 2015 study by Shannon Leupold and colleagues in New England found red squirrels to be the most frequent nest predator of rusty blackbirds at their sites. So further reason to investigate if there's a known relationship between red squirrels and rusty blackbirds. So at this time, I will give another big shout out to Jenna. Hopefully you did attend her presentation on gray-cheeked thrush and red squirrels a few weeks back. If you didn't, I encourage you to look back at it. She gave some great background on ecological principles of invasive species, and she presented some really interesting research on the relationship between the introduced red squirrel and the at-risk gray-cheeked thrush. So one wonderful thing about science and data collection is that there's this possibility to collect really versatile data sets and answer, a variety of questions with one data set. And so in 2017, when I came to Newfoundland to assist Jenna with her data collection on gray-cheeked thrush, while collecting this data, we conducted point counts for all of the birds that we saw and heard. And so this is a common practice in ornithological research, but this practice allowed us to use data collected during that time for her research on gray-cheeked thrush on this study on rusty blackbirds. So this may look familiar to you. It's a similar map to one in Jenna's presentation, as it is the same study site. So the study site was along the east side of the Long Range Mountains at the base of the Northern Peninsula on Newfoundland. And as Jenna mentioned, data was collected over 2 years in 2016 and 2017 from early June to mid-July. And research was based at the cozy field station, the Roost, by the Main River and Upper Humber River watersheds. Elevation across the 257 square kilometer study area ranged from 75 meters to about 600 meters above sea level, and forest cover was dominated by balsam fir and black spruce, as well as white birch, white spruce, and tamarack. And nearly 50% of the study site consisted of spruce fir forest, and 7% of the study site consisted of bog. Survey points were laid out in a grid with 500 meters between adjacent points. Because the points were laid out in this systemic way, habitat at each point could vary quite drastically, and so a total of 8 surveyors visited 1,920 points over the 2-year period, producing an extensive landscape-wide data set. And this paired with Newfoundland and Labrador's forest resource inventory data, which is based on aerial photography, and Natural Resource Canada's CanBEC geospatial data, allowed us to look at how rusty blackbird point count data is influenced, or how rusty blackbird detection is influenced by the site. So during each 11-minute point count, we recorded all birds seen and heard, and also all red squirrels observed. Now, I love to talk about field work. I love field work, and so at the risk of getting a bit sidetracked, I thought I would just say how amazing contributing to field research is. working outside with its, diverse topography, and in Newfoundland, these beautiful rocky peaks and dense balsam fir regen or conifer scrub and old conifer stands, and of course the wet muskeg and the stepping into knee-deep bogs. While sometimes challenging to move through, these landscapes are incredible to work in and make for an exceptional field season. And so contributing to this field data collection is not only fulfilling because of the knowledge gathered and because we're supporting the conservation of birds, but we also can appreciate just spending time outside in these beautiful settings and seeing things, seeing such beautiful sights. And so it's another great reason, I would say, to volunteer for the Breeding Bird Atlas. This sort of structured time, going out, being outside and bird watching, in the structured way, really is an opportunity that's unique. And I highly encourage everyone to to volunteer for the Atlas, to have an experience like this. Anyway, getting back to our field methods, or our methods. So to analyze these data, we used ArcGIS to create buffers around each survey point, each point where we conducted a point count, and extracted land cover data from each buffer area. And the buffer area covered a 347-meter radius around each point. And this buffer size was based on the one study that determined an approximate home range size for Rusty Blackbirds, which was about 38 hectares on average. And that was Luke Powell and his colleagues in 2010 in a study of Rusty Blackbirds that used radio telemetry. And so this data of this sort of land cover data within the buffers could then be used alongside the point count data. Those data comprising of all the squirrels and all the birds seen and heard at each point, to assess the relationship between Rusty Blackbird occurrence and habitat features. So to address these research objectives, we created 31 occupancy models. And in other words, we created 31 reasonable combinations of landscape or habitat features where we expect we might find Rusty Blackbirds based on existing observation and research. As well, every model, we included a combination of foraging habitat, so wet sites where they can get those aquatic invertebrates, and nesting habitat, so something like conifer forests for nesting. And the landscape features included in these models were lakes and ponds, streams, rivers, bogs, conifer dominated stands, conifer scrub, and also areas clear-cut between 1990 and 2004. And the last two features that were included in these models were the presence of red squirrels and elevation. So as you'll recall in Jennas research, red squirrel detection decreased as elevation increased, and gray-cheeked thrush detection increased inversely. So if Rusty Blackbirds were avoiding red squirrels, we might expect to find them more commonly at high elevations. This table is pretty extensive, but the key point is that we made combinations of different variables we would expect to be suitable Rusty Blackbird habitat. And these variables were then tested to see which predict Rusty Blackbird occurrence best. So we found Rusty Blackbirds at 11% of points, so at 209 points total. And these graphs from our 2020 paper show the relationship between the probability of Rusty Blackbirds occupying a point and the proportion of land cover within that area. So as you can see in the top figures, as land cover as the cover of lakes and bogs, ponds and streams increases, and rivers, sorry, as those wet habitats increase, Rusty Blackbird probability of occupancy increases. And as I've mentioned, wetlands and water bodies have been known to be important parts of Rusty Blackbird habitat. So really, this isn't surprising at all that we found this information. We thought perhaps that Rusty Blackbird probability of occurrence didn't increase with conifer cover because conifer forests are so dominant on the landscape and within this study site in particular that they don't specifically need to seek this habitat out. So as you can see, the lines for the relationship between conifer scrub and Rusty Blackbird's probability of occupancy and conifer are relatively flat. So there's not a strong relationship there. So in other words, nesting habitat is not lacking at this site. There's lots of conifers. So Rusty Blackbirds are perhaps seen to be selecting more for their foraging habitat and less for their nesting habitat in this landscape. Interestingly, neither elevation or probability of red squirrel occurrence predicted Rusty Blackbird occupancy well. And there's a chance, so Jenna and her colleagues in 2020 published a paper showing an inverse relationship between red squirrels and water bodies at this same site. So we suspect that maybe red squirrels avoiding the water bodies are actually not interfering with Rusty Blackbirds quite as much, for example, as they might gray cheek thrush, who require those really more dry forest sites. As well, Luke Powell found Rusty Blackbirds mobbing potential predators, and anyone who's had a red-winged blackbird dive at their heads know that those icterids really do tend to be very agitated and aggressive in the breeding season, and so perhaps they're just better at keeping away red squirrels than gray-cheeked thrush are, as timid birds who are maybe more flighty. So further research might look at understanding how Rusty Blackbirds use their home range better and their nesting behavior on Newfoundland. And so I just wanted to talk a little bit about the implications of this study, because much of what we found is pretty predictable. We know that Rusty Blackbirds, prefer wet habitat and conifer forests. So we used our best model to predict occupancy of Rusty Blackbirds across our study site. And you can see that we've been able to predict where Rusty Blackbirds are most likely to occur across our study site with this map here. So the darker green colors denote higher probability of encountering a Rusty Blackbird. And so you can imagine that using models like the ones we've created, you could expand that to a wider part of their range in order to figure out where you might be most likely to see large amounts of Rusty Blackbirds and focus research or conservation efforts based on those findings. So I think the use of that forest resource inventory data, that aerial photography derived data is really helpful to give a big picture of Rusty Blackbirds on Newfoundland. All right, well, I wanted to thank the co-authors and also the field assistants who made the time in Newfoundland so wonderful and are great skilled birders. I cannot help but have a lengthy reference slide, but I also wanted to just note a few interesting additional resources. So the Rusty Blackbird Working Group is an active group working on sort of collecting data on Rusty Blackbirds through they call them like Rusty Blackbird blitzes in the wintering range, and they have like sharing information and compiling all of the research into one spot. So this is a really good resource if you want to learn more about Rusty Blackbirds. And of course, the 2020 Rusty Blackbird Management Plan by the Government of Newfoundland and Labrador is a great resource to learn more about Rusty Blackbirds on Newfoundland and in Labrador, and how, you know, and how the government is working to protect the species. And of course, bird atlases provide so much information on birds as a whole. And you know, the Newfoundland breeding bird atlas is in its infancy relative to some of the other provinces and US states. So if you're interested in learning more about you know, the data that's produced through these atlases, you can look up Rusty Blackbirds on you know, the Manitoba or Ontario or BC breeding bird atlases, and see, you know, what's to come, and, you know, for some interesting, you know, final reports in Newfoundland. And that's it.
Thanks so much, Kathleen. That was really interesting. And you'd think that we were maybe paying you for Atlas promo, but that was all just wonderfully put in by yourself. So
they didn't tell me to. I just did it.
Oh, wonderful. If anybody has any questions, you can feel free to write them in the chat or unmute yourself and ask them out loud.
Jenna, it's Lois.
Hi, Lois.
Hi. I was wondering, well, I've got 3 or 4 questions, but I'll start with one.
Sounds good.
When you say they feed on aquatic invertebrates, are they selective at all about the type of invertebrates that they go for? And that study that you mentioned at the beginning of the talk that had connected the decrease in the Rusty Blackbirds with a decrease in aquatic, their invertebrate food. Were there any specific invertebrates that they saw a decrease in?
Yeah, so I don't believe there's been research on specific, like there has been research on the diet of Rusty Blackbirds. I can't off the top of my head think of like specific types of aquatic invertebrates that they go for. Jen, I don't know if you know if you have greater insight than that. I don't think that there's not a huge amount of research on that. And the same goes for that research on climate warming and their invertebrate prey, unfortunately.
Because I would, well, maybe it just hasn't been done, but I would think wouldn't be too difficult to see whether it's the nice juicy dragonfly larvae or whether it's tiny stuff. I don't know how small they could pick up.
Yeah, I mean, you're quite right. There's, you know, and I don't think I am forgetting anything. So, but I mean, yeah, I think you're quite right that that's a really interesting and important work. And, you know, Newfoundland with so many of them would be a great place to do more work like that.
Lois, I'd say you could just keep asking your questions until someone else pops up with one.
Okay. I do a breeding bird survey, have for several years, and I don't know if we've ever got a Rusty Blackbird on that particular survey. It's in the Codroy Valley. But up around the Corner Brook area, the last maybe 3 or 4 years, all of a sudden, people are reporting rusty blackbirds and seeing them on the Glenmullen stream. I've seen them in the pond near where I live, a pond called Rapid Pond. In the last 2 or 3 years, not many, not as many are being seen on the Corner Brook stream trail. But that seems to go counter to this impression that they're decreasing elsewhere. They seem to be increasing. And in this whole area, there's loads of red squirrels. So it would be interesting if you wanted to try, or somebody wanted to try a predictor on the Humber Valley and see what it showed.
That's pretty cool. Yeah. And I should note that there was a slight increase, a very slight increase in Rusty Blackbird counts in the recent years for the breeding bird survey, but it's nothing compared to the long-term decline. So it's not, no one really knows why the slight increase, but the overall trend has still been more decline. But that's interesting, and yeah, if you've observed that, that would be interesting place to look more deeply into the their population trends.
Yeah, I mean,
Kathleen?
it's
Oh, sorry, Lois, go
just going
ahead.
to say it's all anecdotal and a fairly small area, but it's noticeable.
Yeah, great.
I have a question sort of along those lines, and I may have gotten my facts confused, but if I remember right, you were saying that we seem to have higher numbers of rusty blackbirds here. I think you said Russ Greenberg found that. That, if we detect 8 on a survey here, then, it would be roughly 1 on a survey elsewhere. But do you know if our trend here is the same as other places? Like, in other words, do we have a different population trend? Or did we just start with a whole lot more rusty blackbirds, and so we still have more, but we still have a declining population?
I have to admit that I cannot recall. However, I am almost certain that the declines have been very similar population wide, and they definitely have had declines.
Okay, so we just started with a whole lot more then.
I suppose, yeah. I mean, Newfoundland is full of conifers and wonderful wet boggy lakes and ponds, and so it's a nice place for them as well. I mean, there might be something to the subspecies in Newfoundland. This is purely speculative, right? But who knows whether there's some special kind of trait that the Newfoundland rusty blackbirds could have that allow them to thrive here. But of course, we don't know much about that at all. So another really good reason to do more research on rusty blackbirds here on Newfoundland specifically.
Any chance?
Sorry, Bruce.
Oh, no worries. Any chance the Newfoundland birds respond differently or winter somewhere a little differently?
So they do, I think, winter in, like they're known to have quite relatively high site fidelity. So there is a possibility that it's more a reflection of their wintering grounds. But again, there's not enough information to know sort of concretely what the reasons are behind the differences on the Newfoundland birds.
Sounds like people need to put some trackers on some rusty blackbirds and see where they're headed.
I think maybe.
Jenna, I think we should also start collecting rusty blackbird poop so that we can do DNA barcoding on their poop, and we can find out what they're eating.
Perfect. Sounds good.
Yeah.
Whose job is holding the cup?
You want to come back,
The
Kathleen?
collection cup.
Yeah, come on back, Kathleen. You could join us. Oh, Bruce is going to sign up for that too.
Are they
Lois,
more commonly found in forested or less human inhabited areas?
I think it's more related to, as far as I know, the relationship between having that wet bog and lake habitat and conifer. So because much of their range has quite low population densities, I think it's hard to say whether there's more of a relationship between, like, specifically between disturbed habitat or like sort of urban or peri-urban and very remote habitat. Yeah, much of their winter range is quite remote as it is. Yeah, and a lot of research on rusty blackbirds has been done on blackbirds that are near roads, because that's where it's easiest to conduct the research. So in fact, I think our study was one of few that sort of went a fair bit off roads and didn't have roads as didn't only select along roads. So
But it's so
lots
much
of
easier to select
opportunity
along the
for
way.
additional research.
So you do have to come back this summer, Kathleen.
Perhaps.
I have another question for you. I'm just curious, and again, this was outside the sphere of what you were doing, so you may not know. But you mentioned that high mercury levels in rusty blackbird diet is one of the theorized reasons for their decline. Why would they in particular have high mercury levels? Do you know?
I have to admit, it was a while back when I read that paper. I believe it relates to the fact that they eat primarily aquatic invertebrates, and perhaps biomagnification of mercury in those prey.
Makes sense. Thank you.
Bruce or Lois, did you have other questions? I see you're both still unmuted.
Did you look at nest success at all for anything? You probably didn't have time doing all these point counts in the area, but just curious if you looked at nest success in any of those areas in relation to habitat variables.
Unfortunately not. Yeah, we didn't collect data on that. So that's yet another potential study.
I've seen a few clear-cut areas where there's been rusty blackbirds nesting within the riparian buffers there, and they seem to hold on for a few years actually, but within a few of the spots they've definitely petered out. Like, and I don't know if it's in relation to just that long-term, effects of maybe losing nests or something when things. Anyways, yeah.
Yeah. Well, and I think there was research in Newfoundland, or I believe because of the forestry regulations, the buffer around water bodies there's been the suggestion that perhaps it might be wide enough to allow for rusty blackbirds to have that nesting habitat as well as the foraging habitat. But I mean, again, there's not enough research yet to really get a good sense of the relationship between forestry practices and their nesting success. Yeah.
Did you come across any nests?
I didn't. I saw a male at near one point count who was really, really vocal. And I'm certain there was a nest, nearby, but of course I didn't want to disturb him, and I had to get on to the next point count. Can't get Jenna, the big boss, mad if I don't do all my point counts. No, I'm joking. But no, yeah, unfortunately. Jenna, did you or Catherine, have you?
I haven't actually ever found a nest, but I've seen, I guess, like in the last couple of years, while we're doing atlas surveys, a couple of occasions where like there's one foraging along the side of a little pond or something, and then it like flies directly into a bush. So I can only assume that inside of that bush there was a nest. But again, I mean, I didn't really go poking around in there. So
Same here. All I've seen is carrying food and disappearing repeatedly at the same spot. But
Mm.
you know, like you said, Jenna is a harsh taskmaster. I got to get on with those point counts.
To me, it seemed like a bit of an easier bird to actually find nests for, because I was trying to find nests for a while, because they're not very secretive. They're pretty loud
Yeah.
until they get right into go to
Sure.
the same spot. Anyways,
Interesting. Yeah. Yeah. I guess because they're so vocal. They're like, get away, but really they're saying, come here. That's neat. That's very cool that you saw so many.
From the information that is known, are the nests supposed to be lower down, higher up,
Yeah, like
at
they
a
tend to
particular
be on.
distance from the shoreline? Or
They tend to be relatively close to those wet sites, the lakes and things. They tend to be on like shorter conifers. So I think it was like about 1 to 3 meters high. So they're not in like big tall trees. And Bruce, I don't know if you have, sort of
The
anecdotes
ones-
from your own.
yeah, the ones I found have basically fit that profile. One was hanging in a little skinny tree, right hanging over a pond, so with nothing else around it. I didn't even think the tree was thick enough to support the nest, but it was on there, and they were successful. But that's exactly it. They seem to be right along shoreline and not too high up.
so it should be possible to find where they're nesting around the Glen Mill stream trail.
Yes, for sure. I mean, I've seen a lot of birds around there during the migration period. A lot of rusties seem to pass through the Glen Mill system. I wasn't actually aware of any nests or nesting activity around there.
I don't know,
Not
they
that-
seem to be there a good part of the summer, the last couple of years.
Okay.
And just on the note, actually, there was another study also published in 2020 that looked at Rusty Blackbirds like through the breeding stages, and even the way that they use habitat, and like the specific types of habitat that they use for fledglings. Like fledglings are a little different than nests. So I believe it was fledglings, they're more likely to be in more dense, slightly inward sites, probably because they are like more protected from predators. So that was I believe Patricia Woner in 2020. So that's some other interesting research. So,
Very cool. Does anybody else have any burning questions about Rusty Blackbirds before we call it a night? Looks like all of our curiosities have been sated for the evening. Marilyn in the chat says she finds this info very interesting, lives in Alberta, has never noticed them near water, so was going to pay attention. Perfect. Good to get the word out about these species.
yeah, once you start to sort of think about, I remember walking along a trail here in Ontario, and there's this pond. Oh man, every time I walked past it, I thought one day I'm gonna see a Rusty Blackbird there, and sure enough, I did one day.
That's
So
fantastic.
keep your eyes out. Yeah.
Okay, well, if nobody else has any more questions, then I'll thank you again, Kathleen, for joining us tonight, and thanks everyone for the discussion. Feel free to come out next week for our final webinar of the fall. It should be about dark-eyed juncos, I believe, so feel free to join us next week.
And I'll just say thanks as well, Kathleen. That was great.
Thank
And
you.
it was nice to see you again.
Yes, you as well, and thank you both, and thank you everyone. Always good to talk about birds, am I right?
Yep.
Always. The more the better. All right,
Okay.
take care, everyone. See you next week.
Thanks.
Have a good night,
Good
all.
presentation, thanks.
You.